Hi there folks, Oct here. I've got a follow-up video on the Earthshatter Slayer for you today that is going to be a lot more in-depth than the appropriately named introduction video that came out just a couple days ago. There is some gameplay on your screen right now. I am putting that there as a blatantly obvious ploy to try and get people interested at the beginning of the video before I dive into all of the pretty images that I made going over the gear. And that's what this video is going to go over, by the way. We're going to be talking about all of the different gear slots for this character. I'm going to be giving you some options for them. I'm going to try and give you a range of different budget options. However, in some of the gear options, or in some of the gear slots, there simply won't be super cheap options. As this character was not designed as a league starter, it was in fact designed with a bit of a budget in mind. That said, I'm going to let the gameplay play out from here on out, and after this map clear is finished, I'll meet you on the other side and we'll discuss gear. So stay tuned for that, or skip ahead if you'd like.
I can't do this just yet.
Still safe, Exile. Stay safe.
The void protects its children. Titus. Unwritten battle.
That stretches the sanity of the mind.
Alright, and let's jump right into it. As I said, this video is going to be focused on the gearing for this build. There will be a link to the path of building in the description. There's going to be passive trees in there, a cluster jewel variant, a non-cluster jewel variant, possibly some leveling variants, but this video is going to focus on the gearing, and we will begin with one of the two core pieces of the build, the weapon around which it's built, Tidebreaker. Tidebreaker is a pretty darn decent Fizz DPS weapon. It's got a pretty wide range to its damage, which can make the single target damage a little bit variable. Sometimes it's burstier than others, but it's always pretty darn good. And has the very important line of text, Socketed gems are supported by level 20 endurance charge on melee stun. That is one of the things that we build around in this build using Enduring Composure. No, that's the name of the cluster jewel. Using the Slayer mod. Martial Prowess, I believe it's called. The Slayer Ascendancy point that gives you max endurance charges based off of your max frenzy charges, and then we invest both on gear and in the tree into max frenzies in order to get quite a lot of damage. This is core to the build. I would not recommend attempting it without it. A well-rolled one, especially one that is beast crafted for 30% quality, or even double corrupted for local physical, though that's quite a high budget option, is what you're looking for. Alright, the next most important thing to mention is the chest piece, which is the reason why this build has a bit of an upfront cost to it. This build specifically uses Replica Ferrule's Fur, which is a fairly pricey option. In softcore trade, last I checked, I believe it was going for 30 to 40x, and in hardcore trade it's between 8 and 12. This is used along with Aspect of the Cat to sustain both Frenzy and Endurance charges 100% of the time. Boss fights clearing doesn't matter, you always have your Frenzies and Endurances. This is because when you enter Cat's Agility, you gain your maximum Frenzy and maximum Endurance charges, and we put Aspect of the Cat onto a piece of gear with a socket on it, so helmet, gloves, boots, even an unset ring if you so desire, and you throw less duration support in there. Doesn't have to be linked to anything, just in the item with the Aspect of the Cat, put less duration, and you'll be swapping back and forth between your aspects more frequently, which means you have a faster swap time than your charge duration. So I swap into agility once every 6 seconds, my charges last 12 seconds, I'm refreshing them every 6, so they're basically permanent, presuming I don't spend them or get them taken away by some sort of nullifier rare. Now, all that said, you can use a regular for rules fur instead of a replica, which still isn't that cheap, but not nearly as expensive as a replica. Last time I checked, I believe it was around 6 exalts in softcore trades, so, you know, multiple times cheaper. However, you do have to be very cognizant of the fact that you do not auto-generate endurance charges with a regular for rules fur. So in boss fights, particularly in hardcore, you need to be consistently using your Enduring Cry in order to keep your endurance charges up, not just for the defensive benefits, but also because, alongside the Tidebreaker, they are a very good and very important source of damage. Onto another piece of gear that, while I wouldn't classify as absolutely core to the build, is rather important and one of the early upgrades you should push for in the endgame. The reason for this is a large cluster jewel, specifically an 8.1 to save as many points as possible, with the mace and staff damage nodes in enchantment, is capable of rolling Overlord, which is an extremely powerful notable in, well, pretty much any staff or mace build, but, you know, particularly in the case of this one, as it gives you Fortify for 6 seconds on melee hit with a mace or a staff. That means you can completely eschew the use of Fortify in your main links, instead replacing it with either melee physical damage support or damage on full life, and getting a lot of extra damage as a result. Alongside this, Heavy Hitter is excellent as a great stun scaler, and then some third notable. There's a couple of good leech scaling ones that are relatively easy to get onto your jewel because an Aug Life, provided there's an open prefix, will hit either Flat Life or one of the good 2 leech notables. So it's not too terribly unlikely, if you have Heavy Hitter and Overlord already, that you can very easily land your third notable. You could even augment attack if you wanted to. It opens up the pool to a bunch of different, more or less kind of worse notables, but augment attack with an open prefix will always hit a notable at the very least, and Overlord Heavy Hitter plus other notable is a good enough jewel for sure. Moving on to the boot slot, this is one of the places where, if you're in a hardcore setting, you can choose to go for ailment immunity. This is very worthwhile to do, if a little bit expensive, and can strain you in terms of finding the resistances you need, but you can always try and find some of those resistance affixes on rare jewels. I'd actually suggest that, both clusters and regular ones. However, that said, the way you'll pick up that ailment avoidance, or ailment immunity, is through a Shaper mod here on the boots, which gives 35% chance to avoid ailments. And then you can find a craft on the gloves and or helmet, as well as picking up the 20% from the Ailment Avoid Life cluster on the way over to the Ranger starting area between Ranger and Duelist. 25, 25, 35, and 20 pushes you up to 105%. If you want to drop one of the crafts on the helmet or the gloves, then you will need to go for a Maven Orbed elevated version of a pair of Shaper Touched boots, which gets very expensive very, very quickly, so it's not pictured here in the graphic, but it is an option. I would very much recommend a Avoid Stun enchant. I don't really find stun to be much of a problem in boss fights. If you're tanking super large hits rapidly in succession in a boss fight, you're probably dead, or you're just misplaying. And stun is kind of the least of your worries at that point, if you're simply face-taking die beams or lots and lots of orbs, for instance, in a Noob Elder fight. So the best counterplay to that is to dash away, ideally. And really, stun only becomes a worry while you're clearing, and there's so many hits from so many directions that you can't really manually avoid them. As a result, the stun boot enchant, I find, is more than enough of a defensive layer against that. If you want to be super duper safe, you can also throw on Brine King, but just having the stun boot enchant, I find you can pretty easily swap to Lunaris for mapping if you want to. As well as that, this slot can be used for an extra bit of spell dodge, which I do highly recommend. You can either get that through Elder Influence or through a Temple Hybrid Movement Speed mod. The Elder mod goes higher in terms of dodge, but as a result of it being its own separate mod rather than a hybrid mod with the movement speed, does take up an additional affix on your item, so might be hard to fit in if you're strained for resistances. For the amulet slot, a very basic amulet is simply just going to have life, some stats that you need as an implicit, and an allocation of frenetic. Frenetic is a super valuable anoint for us, as it gives both a frenzy and endurance charge thanks to the Slayer Ascendancy, and it saves a lot of points pathing up the side of Shadow that we really can't spare if we do want to fit in a cluster jewel. So frenetic is my anoint of choice, even though technically in the end game I believe going for tenacity is higher damage. You do lose out on Fizz mitigation from the endurance charge, and the damage difference is relatively minimal, so I stick with frenetic. As you move up in terms of budget, you're looking to get a Essence of Horror craft on the amulet. That is the 15% effect of Fortify. Highly recommend it. An easy way to craft a decent amulet with the Essence of Horror effect is either to try to fracture Essence of Horror itself, but probably more realistically to buy a fractured base that has somewhere around, say, 70 to 80 life on it, and just start throwing Essences of Horror at it until you get a workable amulet out of that base, as you'll be guaranteeing both the life roll from the fracture and the Fortify effect from the essence, so the odds of hitting a pretty good amulet are actually fairly reliable. On any of these amulets, you're going to want to craft non-channeling skills have minus to total mana cost. This is also going to show up on at least one of the rings in order to help solve mana problems. And on the ultimate amulet, that does get pretty expensive to craft. You want an Elder base, and you want maximum total recovery per second from Life Leech. I know there's a lot of different leech stats. This one is the one that's really, really, really strong. And it scales off of Fertile Catalysts as well. If you manage to get this mod without sacrificing, things like Fortify effect and a good life roll, it's going to be extremely noticeable defensively in terms of how rapid your recovery is. However, it is pretty difficult to craft said amulet, as you can't do fracturing on a touched base, so you have a lot more RNG involved. Moving on to some of the other jewelry, let's talk belts. For your basic belt, good life roll, some res if you need it, and utility or further life scaling in the form of either flask charge, gen, or strength certainly isn't bad. When you go to upgrade that though, you're going to want either a Warlord influence belt or an Elder influence belt so that you can roll life recovery rate. Similarly to the leech scaling on the amulet, this recovery rate scaling is extremely, extremely noticeable. I highly recommend this be one of the upgrades you go for relatively soon. Keep a live search up if you're playing in Trade League for basically any belt that'll pop up, even if it's not a Stygian Vise, with a decent amount of life on it, some life recovery rate, and res that allows you to fit it into your build. This is a very, very big upgrade. So you are perfectly fine to back off of a Stygian Vise base for an intermediary upgrade until you can get a Warlord or Elder Stygian and craft your truly GG belt, which, by the way, obviously is going to want Fertile Catalysts, because as with the amulet, Fertile Catalysts scale the life recovery rate mod here. As well as that, if you go for the Warlord belt, I don't know if it's on Elder, I actually haven't checked, but if you go for the Warlord belt and you have an open prefix and you manage to find or purchase an augment crit through Harvest, highly recommend throwing that on it, because the only crit mod it can hit is reduced extra damage from critical strikes, which is a really, really nice defensive stat to have. And anything powerful and deterministic is obviously great. Alrighty, gloves. So, very basic gloves, life, and since there's not many other stats here on a very basic pair of gloves that you'd need, some chaos res is excellent in this slot. You could go for flat physical to attacks, but the amount of physical that you get is relatively minimal compared to the amount that Tidebreaker already brings to the table, so I don't really prioritize it as a mod, although you could get physical damage leached as mana here, and that would save you an affix on a jewel, using a prefix that isn't too valuable, so keep that in mind. Maybe throw it into your live search or whatever if you're playing in Trade League, and see if you get lucky. As far as upgrades go, this slot can be used for Maximum Frenzy. Theoretically, you can use it in two different ways for Maximum Frenzy, as Corruption implicits on gloves can give Max Frenzy, but also Warlord Influence with a Max Frenzy prefix, I believe. You can push it that way. The ultimate pair of endgame gloves is actually technically not pictured here, as being able to corrupt a pair of +1 Frenzy Warlord gloves and get +1 Frenzy on them would be absolutely insane, but just crafting Max Frenzy charge gloves in the first place is a bit of a chore, as the mod has fairly low weighting. So I wouldn't do that unless you've got a lot of money to burn. But hey, if you do, go ahead and I wish you luck. For your helmet slot, like everywhere else, you're going to want a decent evasion base, as this build is dodge and evasion based and not armor based. This is a slot where you can get some ailment avoidance, as I mentioned earlier with the boot craft. And through this, the gloves and the boots, you can go for ailment immunity, provided you've invested into the nodes on the tree between Ranger and Duelist, the life cluster there. For the enchant, starting off, I went for a dash additional cooldown uses or smoke mine grants additional movement speed, both of which are very nice utility enchants and quite cheap because people overlook them, I find. But in the endgame, you will, particularly if you want to focus on bossing, want an Earthshatter 40% increased damage enchant. This isn't massive, but it's better damage than dash plus charges, you know? So if your focus is on bossing and you want that damage to be able to burst them down quickly, which I find is one of the best things you can try and do for the new content, things like the feared and the hidden and the twisted and all those, burst is your friend in those fights, I would say 40% increased damage is a tool that's worth picking up. You know, every little edge you can get matters. In the absolute endgame version of the helmet, you are going to want a Crusader influenced version so that you can get 25% effect of Fortify on you. This is another one of the sources we have for that, alongside the Amulet and some investment on the tree. If you do have a lightning aug, you can actually aug, provided you have a prefix open on this item, and your chances of you will hit either physical damage taken as lightning or maximum lightning resistance. You actually really want maximum lightning resistance, as with 8 endurance charges, potentially a basalt flask, and potentially some fizz mitigation from a talisman implicit or something like that, as I have in my current version of the build. You actually don't really want to be taking physical as lightning. But having some extra lightning mitigation certainly isn't a bad thing. Alright, we're almost through it here. Let's talk about rings. You're going to need a Curse on Hit ring. Now that can be acquired on a Warlord base, and I suggest caster rerolls through Harvest for this, as all of the Curse on Hit modifiers are tagged as caster, and there's not very many caster mods on rings. There's this, and there's cast speed, at least on Warlord bases. So you'll hit vulnerability on hit, and also flammability on hit. I neglected to mention that fairly often, and obviously for this build you want vulnerability. Alongside that, some minus mana cost crafts. You're going to need at least 2 of them across your rings and amulets, so juggle those as you can. You don't need 1 on every piece of jewelry, but 2 out of 3. As you move up in terms of upgrades for this slot, you're going to want to swap to Vermilion rings where you can, and eventually even swap at least one of your rings, probably only one since you'll need a Curse on Hit in the other slot, over to a synthesized ring with the +1 maximum frenzy charge synthesis implicit. Unsurprisingly, we want more frenzy charges everywhere we can get them because they serve double value, arguably even triple value in this build, being damage scaling from the frenzy, damage scaling from the endurance charge, and fizz mitigation from the endurance charge. So it's quite worthwhile to go for a synthesis ring in this slot. And then for the other ring, probably a Vermilion Warlord with Curse on Hit and possibly % melee damage. Fertile Catalysts, again, are your friend. Alright, let's talk about some of the other jewels that bedazzle this build, other than the cluster jewel. Core will be a mana leech source, and I like to find it on a Viridian jewel. You can get it as a prefix on a ring or amulet. You can also get it as a prefix on your gloves, so there's some flexibility here, but I recommend getting it on a Viridian jewel, as I feel 1 affix on 1 jewel in the build is the least opportunity cost to solve this problem, and you only need 1 source of fizz attack damage leeched as mana. You do gotta find at least 1 though. Basic jewels are going to be just % life and a damage scaling percentage stat, so melee damage, area damage, damage with 2 hands, damage with maces, generic damage, global physical damage. You get the picture. Anything that fits the tags or behavior of the build and skill that gives you percent increased damage, that's pretty good. Get some life along with it. For a high budget jewel, I would recommend trying to fit in a bit of attack speed. You don't have a lot of sources of that in this build. If you don't pick it up on a couple jewels here or there, it can feel pretty sluggish while mapping, so I recommend maybe 6 or 7% attack speed on a couple jewels, and picking some up out of your frenzy charges is mostly where the rest of it comes from, which is one of the reasons why the build doesn't work too great without the replica for rules or the regular for rules, because if you don't have your frenzy charges in a boss fight, you feel like you're moving through molasses, and it is not very pleasant. So as mentioned earlier, I'll bookend the video with it. I do really recommend the for rules for the build. For your belt, you're going to want an Abyss Jewel, obviously, and a Murderous or Searching Eye Jewel with life and Onslaught on kill is really all you need. You can find some int here if you're struggling for stats. Ideally, your Amulet Implicit will help solve that, and Tidebreaker itself has 40 int on it, which is really quite helpful. But yeah, if you need a bit extra, you can find it on a jewel, the Abyss Jewel, or one of the basic ones. These can be your problem solvers if they need to be. You don't sacrifice that much damage by giving up damage affixes here. Alright, and last but not least, let's go over Flasks. As I've mentioned a couple times, this is not an armor-based build. You'll see that if you pull up the Path of Building. This is a dodge and evasion build. There's plenty of physical mitigation. You get 7, 8, maybe 9 endurance charges depending on your gear. You get Fortify with Fortify effect scaling. You get generic reduced damage taken while leeching as a Slayer. You get Wind Dancer, so you don't gotta worry about physical damage through those. Instead, we go for evasion and dodge scaling in order to not get hit by more than half of things that would hit us, which is a very powerful defensive layer in its own right. As a result of that, we want to use a Phasing Flask for some extra dodge while clearing. We want to use a Jade Flask in order to get a good base evasion value for things like Wind Dancer to work off of. And if you don't have access to unique damage scaling flasks, a Basalt is fine for a little bit of extra oomph in terms of fizz mitigation, but you could even throw a Sulfur here if you wanted to, just for some damage, because I don't really think you need any more Fizzmit. Obviously a Life Flask is great, even with Slayer, Overleech. It is a very good idea to have an instant Life Flask around in case of really, really dangerous situations you might find yourself in, and a Quicksilver for mobility. As you get the currency, or if you're in Solo Self-Found, which I don't necessarily recommend this build for Solo Self-Found, but more power to you, as you get access to a Lion's Roar, you're going to want to swap that in for the Basalt or the damage flask that I can't remember the name of. You're going to want to swap the Lion's Roar in for that floating last flask. And if you manage to get ailment immunity, you can even drop the Jade for a Bottled Faith if you just want maximum damage on bosses, because despite the fact that we don't go crit, so we don't use the base crit, the Consecrated Ground causing enemies to take increased damage, plus the 40% damage on the Sulfur Flask implicit, just is enough damage to be worth the slot anyway. This flask is just very, very, very good. There's a reason it's worth a lot of currency. Anyways, that's it. That about covers the gear for the build. As I said, there's a path building in the description below. There's also a link to all of the images that were used in the stream here today. If you want to pause on any of them, of course you can in the video, but if you don't even want to do that and you just want to look through them as a little slideshow, they're all going to be up on Imgur, so you can go and check them out there and read through them to your heart's content. And of course, feel free to ask me any questions that you got. I hope if you do go after the build that you enjoy it, and I hope that even if you don't choose to play the character, which, you know, fair enough, it is a little bit pricier compared to my usual builds, I hope that you still enjoyed the video, and I hope that you enjoyed this format. If you did, and you want to let me know how I might be able to improve it, or you just liked it and you want to let me know that, please do leave that feedback below. I read everything that gets posted, so I'd be happy to see your comments. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a good night, morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it is, wherever you are, and I'll see you in the next one.